Hello and welcome back to Like Maria. Today I'm going to talk you through child language acquisition and the sort of text you might get in the exam, which will be a transcript of a child speaking with someone, other children or an adult. So this is for English language A-level, and we are going to look at the transcript, and I'm going to tell you 5 things that you would really need to look out for in a transcript. The way I'm going to organise this is I'm going to first look at grammar, then phonological processes, Lexis, discourse features, and finally child-directed speech and the context surrounding the transcript. This is not an exhaustive list of the things that you need to analyse, but it is a guidance to the thought processes that should be going on in your head. So let's get started. Grammar. To begin with, we are looking, and this is where you're going to get the really high marks, at the grammatical structures of child language usage. We want to look at negative formation. We want to look at question formation. And both of these will involve thinking about auxiliary verbs, whether the child has progressed far enough to use auxiliary verbs like I do not have instead of just not have, and whether they have started to use auxiliary verbs and swapping around the verb and the pronoun in questions, like are you coming? So really look closely at formation of negatives, formation of questions, and look to see if auxiliary verbs are being used. And this will give you a real good idea about how competent the child is with grammatical usage. The other thing to look at when you're talking about grammar is tenses and number. So tenses showing past, perhaps looking at future, looking at adding ing to an end, and also number, singular and plurals. Has the child managed plurals appropriately? Are they using plural in an appropriate context? Are they using the tenses in the appropriate context and in the right place? Now, really key, extra little tip here is when you're thinking about tense or number, to think about Chomsky. Chomsky, the theorist who cites virtuous errors. So virtuous errors are when tenses or plurals are formed in a regular pattern on irregular formations. So for example, if the child says I goed instead of I went, or there are 5 mouses instead of 5 mice, Chomsky would regard these as virtuous errors. And of course, there's plenty to say about that with his theories. Okay, so that's grammar. Next, moving on to phonology. So when we're looking at phonology of a transcript, we're thinking about phonological processes. Here we're thinking of moments when the child says things we could say incorrectly, or they are learning how to say things correctly, but they are missing key bits. So for example, we might be looking at syllable deletion, where a syllable is omitted. So it might be an unstressed syllable at the beginning of the word, something like nana instead of banana. So that's when something's been missed out, a deletion. We also have things that are sometimes compressed together, and we call these reductions. So a typical example that you might come across is cool instead of school. And this is called a consonant cluster reduction. So when the sk has been missed out and the child has only managed to do the k phoneme, cool instead of school. Another example of a phonological process where a child is beginning to say things and is just mismanaging the hardware in their mouth would be something like wabbit instead of rabbit. It's a particular example of a glide. It's known as a glide, where the consonant is being said in a slightly different way. So look out for all those types of phonological processes. You should have quite a long list in your revision notes to learn. Do make sure that you're engaging with that and thinking, how is this being said? How is it sounding? The next area I would look at is Lexis, lexical development. So I'm hoping you all understand about overextension and underextension. So examples of this would be a child calling all men dad. So pointing at a man in the supermarket and calling him dad. That would be overextension. The opposite is having a very specific word for something. So if the family pet is referred to as dog and the child hasn't managed to make the jump to know that other dogs are also called dog. So there are two types of different ideas with the difficulties that a child has. They're getting to learn vocabulary, but they're using it not quite in the right way. I would also recommend you look at, in terms of Lexis, pointing and labelling language, particularly deictic expressions when the child is pointing and using this, or pointing and using the colour, or saying lovely, or pointing and saying table, dog. So these deictic expressions often part of a child transcript that you will receive in the exam, and they're really good to comment on because you can say that the child is quite advanced in using deictic expressions, particularly to label different things. Under Lexis, I would also look at content words versus structural words, and to be able to comment to whether we're using words such as open class words describing different things and different actions, or closed class words that are more part of the structure of the language, use of pronouns, for example, and prepositions. So being able to talk about that and see that the child has moved perhaps from one to the other. So an advanced child will be able to use the pronouns, for example, me and my, referring to themselves rather than using their name. So lots there to think about in Lexis. As I've said, this is just a cursory reminder, but really often very fruitful analysis can come from Lexis. A really key feature that I think you should absolutely look at is discourse features. Now, these are often forgotten, and it's about the structure of the text and the interaction between different speakers. So in this section, I would definitely consider turn taking, look at any interruptions or overlaps. I would look at who is the dominant speaker and who is controlling the topics, who moves on to a new topic and shifts the topic on, who is doing the questioning, who is doing the answers. So this is all about looking at the shape of the discourse and the relationship between the different speakers. Here, this is really important when you get a transcript, not just to look at the main speaker that you've been asked about, which would be the child, but to look about how they're interacting, because it shows about the cooperative principles that the child is learning, and sometimes politeness features as well. So do please take care to note that. Another key area that you should look at is the context of the transcript. Now, this again is something that we can sometimes overlook. Number one, look at the description at the top of the exam paper. When it asks you the question, it will say how old the child is and what they're doing. So quite often it's an activity like mealtime or bath time or getting dressed. And that's important because it frames the rest of the text. You should also consider in the context, if the child is talking with an adult, any features of CDS, that's child-directed speech. Some of you may know it as caretaker language. So look at things that the adult is doing. Look at their volume, look at repetition, reinforcers, the sing-song voice, the way they are offering praise. And here it's really good idea to get in some theory. So you might be able to mention Catherine Snow, who first observed this caretaker language, this CDS. You might be able to talk about Skinner, who talks about children learning by imitation. And if the adult says something and then the child says it, you can refer to Skinner. And another key one to think about is Vygotsky here. Vygotsky talks about having a more knowledgeable other. And if the older child or the adult is saying things more fluently and perhaps dominating the conversation, but the young child is joining in, there we have great evidence for Vygotsky's learning styles, where he says the adult or the older child can operate as a more knowledgeable other towards which the younger child moves and aspires to speak like. So there we have our 5 things to consider when analysing a child language transcript.